We now return to our top story of Russia-Ukraine conflict and the ceasefire developments. Joining me is Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, former senior diplomat, seasoned diplomat, also a former Secretary MEA. Good evening and welcome, sir. Now, how do you read the momentum towards negotiated peace as far as Russia-Ukraine conflict is concerned, even as the intense fighting we know continues?
I'm particularly pleased that the momentum is moving towards peace rather than continuation of war. And I think that is the most significant development that we've seen over the last few days. And I see three principal actors over here. The Americans, principally led by Trump, who have changed the course of US decision-making and their support to Ukraine now moving towards the establishment of peace. The second is the two principal players in the business, which is Russia and Ukraine. And while Russia was continuing the war and Ukraine was receiving support from various allies in Europe and America to continue the war, there seems to be a new thinking on that. And this has come about largely because of the US interventions, first with Russia in Riyadh, and then with the Ukrainians again in Riyadh. And now I understand that there will be further talks which will probably have both the Ukrainians and the Russians. And I think there's a third actor over here, which is the Europeans. And I think in some ways the Europeans have been shut out of the process. And they are trying to get back into it, which they should, because for them, this is a very important development that is taking place. But I warmly welcome the momentum towards peace.
Right. Ambassador Bhattacharya, I want to talk about some immediate developments. While there is a certain understanding to pause attacks on one another's energy infrastructure to begin with, that President Putin also agreed with, but President Zelensky says that Russia has not lived up to that first commitment. So what really is in store then for the larger ceasefire that we're talking about?
Right. No, I think we must be careful about this process of negotiation and must realize that a lot of this will be step by step, and it may not be possible to get everything in the first round itself. As you would recall, when the negotiators had come out of Riyadh after the discussions with the Ukrainians, it did appear that there would be a much broader 30-day ceasefire. And I think there were discussions which were looking at, not conclusive, which would look at air, sea, and land. But I think what happened in the process of the conversations that President Trump had with President Putin and then subsequently also with President Zelensky, this got diluted to certain elements alone and not the entire process. But I don't lose heart in that because I think it's a process that's going on. There will also be some posturing, and I think President Putin has put out a rather maximalist position, which is what Russia would like to put out at this stage. And while Zelensky, before he went to Oslo, had a more conciliatory approach about agreeing with President Trump's proposal, once he went to Oslo, he had a slightly different tone because all the Europeans were there. So there will be some going back and forth on this, but I think we should not worry too much about it.
And sir, once the talks begin between the delegates of US and Russia on Monday, would you say that two of the most contentious issues are going to be, one, the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and you could read it either ways from Ukraine or Russia's perspective, and the security arrangement in the region?
Right. I would think from the Russian perspective, the security aspects, the kind of deployments that might be there in Ukraine, the kind of rearmaments that Ukraine might get during this period will be of key concern. Whereas for Ukraine, the key issue would be what is the kind of formulation they have regarding the areas that are currently under the occupation of Russia. And so I feel that on both these issues, there will be little or no conclusion at the talks that will probably take place in Riyadh in a couple of days. But what I do think will happen is that they will agree on the parameters for the ceasefire. So whether this is going to be just energy infrastructure, whether this is going to include some other facilities, communication centers, connectivity centers, ports, airports, what kind of elements would be included in this? And I think some of that detail will be worked out between the technical people who will be meeting. And I think once you have that initial phase of ceasefire, once there is a relative calm, you can actually sit back a bit, both Ukraine and Russia, and reassess the situation to get onto those two very key issues that you rightly mentioned about the security scenario as well as the territories.
So you earlier mentioned that the manner in which Europe has been shut out of the talks, for now at least, and there's a flurry of activity in Europe that we see, from concerns about security for Ukraine to their own future in the days ahead. How do you see the kind of role that Europe is likely to play in the negotiations ahead and beyond that?
I feel Europe has a very key role in this entire business. I think the reason why the Americans have shut the Europeans out was because America felt that Europe was not contributing sufficiently to the cause of overall defense of that particular theater. And therefore, Europe needed to make greater commitments to the defense expenditures that it was going to make and the kind of defense postures that it would have, particularly regarding the GDP, the defense expenditure to GDP ratio, the kind of force lift capabilities that it would have, and the kind of attitude and approach it might have towards, in future, towards Russia. And I think it was for this reason that Europe was somewhat kept out of these negotiations, somewhat kept out. But I don't think that's going to be the medium-term solution either, because Europe will have to be integrated. At the end of the day, this is in their backyard. They will need to be consulted and they will need to be involved, because if they're not, they will actually end up being spoilers to a peace process. And that's not something that we would wish to have.
And this shutting out of Europe also appears like a certain symptom of at least the idea of dismantling of the Western bloc of America-led West. Do you also see that idea being challenged ever since President Trump has taken office?
You know, quite frankly, I see this has kind of gathered momentum during the Trump presidency in the last few weeks. But this is not a new idea. When the idea of Europe was coming about, and they had agreed that they would not have a war amongst themselves, they did say that they would need to prepare for war against external forces. And even after the Cold War, so to say, came to a close, Europe did not give up its Cold War because its opposition to Russia continued. But it did not put in the material that was required for its own defense purposes. There was discussion, say, about 2 decades ago, when the European Union was talking about building force capability of its own, of independent brigades, of lift capacities, of its own R&D being converted into armaments that would go into the European armies. But that did not continue. Of course, there were various factors, including the economic situation, which was somewhat recessionary in large parts of the larger countries of Europe. But that said, Europe did not pitch in for the defense effort as it could have and it should have. But today, I think we see there is a change in that approach, and that will bring about the new balance that will be required, and Europe will play its due role, I'm sure.
But given the new bonhomie between the United States and Russia, what are the real stakes, according to you, for Ukraine when American and Russian delegates meet in Riyadh?
So, I think this is really a two-stage scenario. One is that geoeconomics has shifted from the European continent towards Asia. And I think the Western world needs to look at this particular issue. And the involvement or close partnership with Russia would actually be beneficial for Europe to get back its economic muscle. You do realize that at some point of time, not very long ago, the G7 had expanded to a G8. and that the Europeans were depending heavily on Russian fuel to power their economic growth. And that can come back again, and that would help revive their economy, which is very important and an extremely essential element in the overall configuration of national power. And the second thing is about power itself, because today, Europe is more content saying that they are depleting Russia. But that is a very fallacious concept in itself, because Russia is a much greater power than the Europeans would wish to admit in public, particularly when they are engaged in a war against it. And so the fact that the geopolitics will require that Europe be a viable strategic unit of force that can actually play its due weight is something that was missing. And I think that adjustment is being, in a sense, forced by the Trump era. But I think this is something that many people in the Europe had been thinking about. There are also new political trends within Europe, if you look at it more deeply. And many of these are looking at a greater role for Europe itself, not just about, the 2 or 3 larger countries in Europe leading the charge, but of having a more cohesive unit of Europe, of European identity that can then assert itself. So that will bring about this new balance that is necessary, because it's quite clear that US is definitely not the only superpower. It has to work with many others. The bonhomie that you see is perhaps an exaggerated comment, but perhaps it is something that is necessary to bring about the relations, the understanding of what Russia can mean in the second part of this 21st century. Because the 20th century was another story. Particularly the second half was one of animosity and competition. But can this be different in the 21st century?
And finally, sir, India has articulated a clear position on the Ukraine war in favor of peace. But how do we look at the geopolitics as it is getting transformed today, and particularly the world after the ceasefire, as and when it's achieved?
Right. In some ways, it vindicates our position, because, we have always had this very principled position that you should strive for peace, not war. That is not the way we deal with things in the 21st century. Prime Minister had said that this is not the era of war. And I think that had not been fully understood by many in Europe. And I think many of the statements off the cuff that had come from European leaders were rather uncharacteristic, but also, they were not fully understanding what the reality of the situation was. So I think now we have this situation where we have this ability to have peace, even if it is transient, even if it is for a short period of time, during which you can give diplomacy a chance. Essentially, you need to have negotiated settlements. Nobody's saying that the areas that have been taken over by Russia should remain with them or should not, or Ukraine needs to secede. This is something that Ukraine and Russia need to figure out. But I think this has to happen in a calm mind, in a calm atmosphere, not in the heat of war. This cannot happen. And therefore, I think we are now getting back to the right track. And India's role in this must finally be acknowledged, because we had steadfastly talked about it. And there are other theaters, if I may add at this point, where we still see the continuation of conflict or of the use of force or the threat of use of force. And I think those tendencies need to be curbed in other centers as well.
On that note, Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, thank you very much for joining us on the News Hour and sharing your perspective.